Hello, and welcome to the GITEX Tech Waves podcast, bringing you the latest trends and innovations in the shifting tides of tech worldwide. I'm Mayowa Adegoke, and on today's episode, we'll have an exciting conversation on the flourishing tech investment and startup landscape in Africa. Two of the most awaited speakers joining the stage of GITEX Africa 2024, the region's largest tech and startup show from 29th to 31st of May in Morocco, are here with me today. Our first special guest is Bongani Sithole, the CEO of Founders Factory Africa, a VC that raised over $114 million in 2023 and provides investment as well as support for early-stage founders building solutions to local and regional challenges. I'd also like to welcome Tomiwa Aladekomo, the CEO of Big Cabal Media, one of the most engaging Nigerian media companies covering tech, culture, innovation, entrepreneurship, and entertainment across the continent, including titles like Tech Cabal. Bongani and Tomiwa, a pleasure to have you both on the show.
Thank you so much. Good to be here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Lovely. Let's get into this conversation. I'll start with you, Sithole. We're looking at the resilience of the African ecosystem, talking about a globally, challenging time in terms of funding, but we see 28% increase in capital raised by African founders and entrepreneurs in Q3 2023. That's quite exciting and shows a resilience that I think is admirable. What would you say is the current, what does that say about the industry? How does this set apart entrepreneurs and founders? What has been different? And why do we see this sort of resilience in Africa?
First and foremost, I'd say that Africa is a really exciting market, and we continue to see founders who are very entrenched into their local markets and finding challenges that they strongly believe that they can be able to solve. And hence the reason why as Founders Factory Africa, we're focusing on supporting these local entrepreneurs through local talent to be able to build with local nuances. And what that does, it helps us to find opportunities to be able to build scalable solutions into global markets. And the 20% uplift that you're speaking of, I think for us that is exciting because it's starting to show the upside of the challenging time that we have just been through as an ecosystem, that definitely there's still innovative solutions that are investable in the continent with great founders. And the second thing that I would say is that we're starting to see some exits on the continent, second-time founders coming in to support early-stage founders, and that in itself creates a flywheel in the ecosystem. And I think for the most part, that is starting to give investors confidence that Africa is still a place to invest.
Would you say that this is now leading into more opportunities?
Of course, I think Africa, geographically speaking, if you look at the four big markets, there's no doubt, right? A market of $3.2 trillion with over 1 billion people. Opportunities across these markets, they still remain, right? So for us, I think we strongly believe that definitely Africa is on a path to rise, and of course, investors have to look at Africa as an opportunity. And of course, ecosystem players as people who are very invested in local markets to help these entrepreneurs build and attract capital.
So Tomiwa, I'm coming to you now. Can you give us an update? We just wrapped up first quarter 2024. What are the numbers saying and how do they compare with the performance from 2023?
So we started the year off relatively weak with about $83 million raised in January, which was sort of an 84% or 85% year-on-year drop. That rose quite significantly in February with a total of $270 million raised across African startups. So a pretty strong increase from January. A lot of that came from sort of the February, I think $100 million raised by Move, which is a mobility startup. And so I think like Bongani said, there definitely is some resilience to the ecosystem. And I think that where we are encouraged is also seeing sort of some of the more experienced startups and sort of the growth stage startups being able to raise this capital. And it shows that there are a number of startups across the continent that are solving sort of significant problems with technology, and they have sort of motivated operators and strong operational teams sort of guiding those startups. And we think that that's where really the opportunity is. There's no shortage of challenges on the continent that you can apply technology to sort of solve. And the more experienced the operators we have in the market, the more people who have gone through sort of startups and gone through the cycle from sort of founding to Series A, Series B, or exit. I think that the more sort of successful startups you'll see. I think it's still a challenging funding market because interest rates sort of have gone higher in the West. But as long as we continue to build companies that are solving real problems, and as long as we continue to churn out the kind of founders and the kind of business leaders that can make their case to the world, and I think that there's still a very strong opportunity for African startups, and I think that we will see that funding start to pick up as sort of markets balance a little bit against sort of the change in interest rates, etc., and as people kind of take another look at Africa.
So I'd like to ask your thoughts on which steps can be taken to further stimulate investment as well as entrepreneurial activity across the region.
I mean, for us, look, I think we're going to tell our stories, and we're going to tell our stories well. And obviously, I run Tech Cabal, and so kind of our fundamental role is telling these stories to a global audience and helping them to see and understand what's happening on the continent, who's doing work that matters. And we do that on a daily basis, through our newsletters, our websites, etc. But also events, whether it's GITEX Africa, whether it's something like Moonshot, which Tech Cabal does in October in Lagos, Nigeria. It's things that give sort of global investors an opportunity to come to the continent, to meet with startups on the continent, and to understand the lay of the land. It can sometimes be quite difficult to understand the specific challenges, the specific opportunities on the continent when you're sitting down in Silicon Valley, or you're sitting down in Shanghai or Dusseldorf, wherever it is. I think the opportunity is to come to the continent, is to meet the founders, is to see the market, is to actually understand what's happening on ground, and then to meet sort of the very motivated people who are building and solving, who are building great startups and great businesses and solving key problems on the continent.
Spoken like a true storyteller. Bongani, what do you think?
Yeah, it's true. I completely agree with Tomiwa around the fact that Africans have to tell African stories in an African way. I think there's also a misconception that African ventures are just solving African problems. And I can tell you now, as a Pan-African company, we have seen a need of ventures that started somewhere in parts of Africa that have a huge need in other parts of the world, right? So as much as we are building for Africa, I think we are building solutions that in themselves are exportable into other markets. And I'll give you one example. We have an asset financing startup that started in Uganda called ASAC. And they've just recently did an acquisition in Latin America as an expansion path, right? So that tells you that African solutions, as much as they're based in finding pathways to solve and scale in an African market, we definitely have innovation that is exportable in nature. I'm saying this because of a couple of reasons. One is, if we can show a lot more scale and export into other markets, that in itself should start to close the trust deficits that global market has with Africa. The second thing is that if we are showing that we are building global solutions, that in itself should start to bring LPs and investors into the continent. The third is, I strongly believe that Africa needs to find GPs who know how to build businesses, right? I say this because I strongly believe that if we can find GPs who know how to build and scale ventures, that would be a pathway for some of these early stage entrepreneurs, finding pathways to building global solution, in itself attracting global capital and talent into the continent, and exports, of course. So I think those three things, in my point of view, if you combine all of them to what Tomiwa said, it's a way in which we can tell African stories and what we are capable of doing.
And speaking of Tomiwa, I saw you nodding your head just a little while ago. What are some of the other unique challenges or opportunities that we see in the African ecosystem that perhaps impede scaling business, accessing international markets? What can you say to this?
Okay, I'm going to just speak to one thing that Bongani mentioned, and I'll talk about sort of unique challenges or unique opportunities. I really like his point around sort of building for global markets, and I think that's become an even more important thing in the recent past. So the last couple of years, a number of the key markets have had big currency challenges, have had sort of like big inflation challenges, and so building for a global audience becomes more and more important. And I think that that's kind of the next big leap that you want to see African startups make, is really like more and more of them building for a global audience rather than just for Africa. And we've got a number of key challenges on the continent to solve, but increasingly we must build solutions that can be used across the world and that, you know, sort of allow us to not be so sort of exposed to these markets alone. In terms of unique challenges, I think talent continues to be one of the really big ones. Again, from a leadership perspective, I'm happy to see sort of as just more founders and business leaders go through these startups, you have stronger and stronger leadership. But educating sort of like the people who will support those business leaders continues to be a really big challenge and opportunity for the continent. So we need more technical staff. We need more people who can support startups in everything from business development to design to operations to customer service. You just need like a larger and a pool of people for startups to recruit from. So again, it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity space. And you can see, you know, in some countries, you see them sort of like starting to think productively about how to tackle that challenge. So with like Nigeria, you have sort of like the Ministry of Comms, Innovation and Digital trying to train 3 million technical talents over the next sort of 4 years. And that's the kind of thing you want to see across the continent. You know, we did a session in Nairobi fairly recently talking about AI regulation versus innovation. And one of the things that came up quite strongly was the continent needs to build AI products, but thinking about regulation that encourages productivity across the continent, that allows us to actually be producers within this space rather than just consumers within this space. That's going to require a ton of technical talent. It's going to require trained AI engineers, trained software engineers. It's going to require all the supporting skills to make sure that that space actually works and is productive. And so if you want to see great AI startups coming out of Africa over the next sort of 18, 24, 36 months, we've got to ramp up the number of sort of like talents and people with the capacity that will support those startups and that will, you know, sort of be solving interesting problems in ways that build interesting companies. So I think that's a big opportunity space for us on the continent, talent.
I quite agree. And if there's something Africa has no shortage of, it is those numbers. Bongani, how can we get more people aware of this opportunity? Because what I see here is an opportunity. How can we do more to get more people in the room, more people having these conversations, and more people aware of the opportunity?
So I think it's important to think about the geographical limitation that Africa has had for many years. I traveled to Egypt recently, just talking to ecosystem players there, and thinking about participation of the ecosystem there to the rest of Africa, and how we can make that happen, right? And what is that connection that we need? And thinking also about how does the Egypt and GCC connected, and how do you actually disseminate all the capital coming in and opportunity downstream? And there is an opportunity for the ecosystem to think about how we actually get together, not just for, and I agree with Tomiwa, not just for training only, but how does training lead to outcomes that is needed, right? And I was having a really good conversation around the potential of AI and infrastructure. And one person asked the question, does Africa need infrastructure or does it need talent support? And the answer really was, we need to start with talent, right? Infrastructure will follow. So we need to really bring, one government into these conversations, to big ecosystem players, VCs and LPs, to huddle around opportunities that exist in the continent, and to look at how we can create the cross-pollination across the 4 big markets, and how we can share these opportunities. And as Founders Factory Africa, we are starting to think about how we create that cross-pollination with players like, Big Cabal, TC, et cetera, because I think what Africa needs is not us competing with each other. It's rather surfacing these opportunities and figuring out how we can work together to start to cross-pollinate talent opportunities across the market and where capital is needed the most in order for us to build the ecosystem. The last thing that I'm going to say is that one of the signals that one looks at in a growing ecosystem is when you're starting to see exited founders coming back into the ecosystem, helping early stage founders to start to build further faster. If it takes 8 years for an early stage venture to get to Series A, how can we reduce the time? And what we need is ecosystem players, including exited founders, to show early stage founders how you actually build quickly. And by doing that is how we actually build the ecosystem so that we start to shorten the time of learning, shortening the time to, getting to market and opportunities across various markets in Africa. And that, I think, is how we need to bring all of these ecosystem players. And I think, GITEX actually play a substantial role in bringing all these, parties together into one table to talk about opportunities in Africa.
Great. Tomiwa, what are some of the other exciting trends or developments that you're seeing in the ecosystem that the world should be paying attention to right now?
I think, what are interesting spaces? I think commerce is an interesting space. Still a lot of work happening in there across the continent. And so people building interesting sort of startups, just trying to solve that problem. And so I think you have quite a number of them that are worth kind of paying attention to, and also kind of getting a bit more mature, solving a number of different linkages in that space. So I think that's an interesting problem space. Still lots to do in fintech. It's interesting how many payment startups we have across the continent and how much work there still is. And so if you're still trying to make, whether it's cross-border payments, whether it's remittances, whether it's just in-country payments, still a lot of opportunity there, still a lot of problems that need to be solved. I think that some of the more exciting spaces, I see a lot more happening in climate tech. Kenya is a really big market for that, but even in Nigeria, I see a lot. Even in South Africa, I think there's a fair bit of kind of work happening in that space. And so that's an opportunity. I think another thing that's worth paying attention to on the continent is we've got the big four markets, so Egypt, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. But I do see a lot more happening in the smaller markets, sort of pushing into the tech space. And so that's everything from, Algeria, DRC, Senegal, so smaller markets where there's kind of quite a bit of deliberate focus, both by the startups and by the governments to sort of push their startup spaces, to encourage people, markets like Tunisia, where there's quite a bit of really interesting activity. So they're not as big as Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, or Egypt, but still interesting things happening in those spaces. You had something like Wave, kind of being like the first francophone unicorn, and again showing, look, there's opportunity in these spaces. There are people building interesting things in these markets, so it's worth paying attention to them as well. You've seen a proliferation of startup acts across the continent, trying to make it easier to do business. I think the Algerian government is pushing an interesting effort to see if they can get cross-operability of those startup acts, so that if you are recognized as a startup in Nigeria, you might also be recognized as a startup in Senegal based on the definitions of the Nigerian Startup Act, which is an interesting kind of effort. But I think those things are really interesting efforts, and they push the startup space and push the technology space forward in meaningful and important ways.
Thank you. Bongani, what are some of the native tech applications or practices that new founders in Africa are embracing that will significantly impact the next generation of unicorns on the continent and even globally?
Great question. I'm going to answer it this way. Any market needs two things to build businesses. One is you need to figure out infrastructure challenges and build for such. And then once you have that layer, there's a second layer on top of it, which is services, right? And I'll give an example. If you look at mobile money, we have built a really great infrastructure, right? And today you're seeing so many fintech businesses building on top of that infrastructure, right? Those are service businesses that rely on that infrastructure. And I think Africa has to look at more infrastructural opportunities that we need to build in order to enable service businesses on top of that to be built so that we can be able to thrive. And we're seeing that, in climate, we're seeing, opportunities in health, where we need to build quite a lot of infrastructure solutions that would in itself enable new ventures building service on top of that. And that, I think, is a combination of how we can start to look at new opportunities that can lead us to unicorns. The second thing that I would say is that there is interesting shift, right? If you look at banks and telcos starting to overlap, right, in their business models. And what that means is that now banks are sort of at a race to zero in terms of their business models, and now starting to look at new opportunities of how they can actually continue to run their business. And that's why you'll see most banks in Africa, they're starting to talk about platform play, right? Where they're diversifying their offering. And for them to be able to do that, they're now turning into startups and saying, where's innovation? How can we buy this innovation forward in order for them not to be disrupted? So we're starting to see like traditional old businesses starting to look at innovation as a way to continue their models. And I think there's a huge opportunity there for new entrepreneurs to start to build solutions that can actually build on top of these old infrastructures, but starting to turn them into new business models. And I think that in itself can start to breed new unicorns in the continent. You talk about banking, you talk about telcos, you talk about insurance, which accounts for quite a substantial amount in the GDP of Africa. And I think that's where an opportunity, that's where an opportunity lie. And again, it speaks to a combination of infrastructure and services and starting to disrupt the traditional business models and breeding new innovation that can in itself drive towards unicorns.
Thank you. Final question. What do you look forward to at GITEX Africa 2024? I'll start with you, Tomiwa.
Mostly I look forward to meeting people. So I think what's meaningful for us is to meet key players within the ecosystem, people doing the most interesting work, players who are coming into the ecosystem. So global investors, global players looking to understand Africa. And so meeting and speaking with those people and understanding what is interesting to them, telling their stories, and building business opportunities for us and for the startups that we cover is what's exciting to us. Yeah.
Bongani?
Yeah, just to add on top of what Tomiwa said, I think for us the really interesting thing about GITEX, besides opportunities of meeting startups, meeting ecosystem players, we're hoping that some of the LPs can attend, right? And the reason for that is not asking for money. It's really just to understand what LPs are looking for. Do they understand Africa? How can we actually, share African stories with them? How can we actually help them to understand the continent even better, right? And we can showcase, opportunities, innovation in Africa, and in that way we can start to attract more capital into the continent. I think if we can be able to, to understand what they're looking for, then we can be able to package Africa in a better way through storytelling.
Thanks to Bongani and Tomiwa. I'm pretty sure the audience is super excited to learn more from you both at the second edition of GITEX Africa, the region's largest tech and startup event. Get ready to join thought-provoking discussions in an immersive 3-day event taking place from 29th to 31st of May in Marrakesh, Morocco. Stay tuned for more updates at www.gitexafrica.com. Subscribe, and of course, don't forget to follow the event social at GITEX Africa.